of notes titled The Great War, Part 2, World War I, the Homefront. This is Part 2 of the Great War. Let's begin. World War I for females. So women were only allowed in the Navy during World War I. In World War II, women will be allowed to serve in every branch of the military. But 130,000 women would serve as nurses and secretaries employed in the war in the branch of the Navy. Female involvement in the war would aid their cause for suffrage in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. That's the most important thing for females, that it was really World War I and their participation in the war that proved that they deserved the right to vote. Very important. Women would also become a large part of the labor force here at home. Victory gardens were planted by many women to save food for the soldiers, because if you're growing your own food at home, then food manufactured in the factories can be sent over to soldiers overseas. Also, fashion starts to change. Previous fashion used to be long dresses, a lot of fabric, very wealthy looking, but then because of World War I, fabric will be conserved for the war effort, for soldiers, and also it's easier to work in those shorter and less fabric clothing, and so that definitely changes during World War I. Workplace for the women. Many women worked more during World War I than they had before. Women worked in different industries that were previously male-dominated, things like construction, even bricklayers, teamsters, driving trucks, to the police department and fire department. So these women are doing previously male-dominated jobs. But despite all the work they're doing, there's still gender segregation during this time period. And so women were being paid less than men. And also when the soldiers come back from the war, women have to give up many of those jobs back to the men. When it comes to the Food Administration, they persuaded Americans to have meatless and wheatless days for the war effort. So every so many days during the week, they would say that you couldn't eat meat or wheat, and that was to preserve food for the soldiers overseas, and also to keep people from spending money on food. Instead, they would have to spend money on the Liberty Bonds to support the war effort. The Harlem Hellfighters, a famous group, they were some of the first African Americans to fight in the war. They were from Harlem, New York. The French were the first ones to use them in the trenches, and they proved that blacks are able to fight just as well as whites. You would have thought that the Civil War had proved that with the 54th Massachusetts and others, but again, we are slow learners. Segregation, however, unfortunately still existed. It's not until after World War II, 1948, that Harry Truman desegregates the military and sets that trend of desegregation. But during World War I and even World War II, blacks are not allowed to fight in the same unit as whites. During World War I, blacks were only allowed in the army. Division over the war. Many wanted to be equal before they died for America, while others saw the Great War as opportunity. So the question is worth noting, what are the blessings and curses of war? What are the unintended consequences of war, and what are the opportunities of war? Well, definitely for women and for blacks, the war was seen as an opportunity to mobilize themselves, to prove their work, to prove their status. But there were other African Americans who wanted to be respected before they would die for a country that still embraced segregation. So definitely a sacrifice to be had, and those who did fight definitely did lay the groundwork through their blood for the later civil rights movement. The Great Migration, this was a huge demographic change. After the Civil War, blacks stayed in the South. Many people think that blacks moved to the north where it was safer after the Civil War, but in truth, there was no opportunities for blacks in the north. So most blacks stayed in the south with family. They worked on the same sharecropping plantations that they had before. So there was virtual slavery that still existed, even though the 13th Amendment was passed. But it's really World War I that provides the opportunity for blacks to move to the industrial centers of the North. Now, the sad thing is that after the war, many blacks would have to give back their jobs to whites. And so that would create some poverty in these cities like Chicago and New York and Philly. So sad case that would happen there. When it comes to the War Industries Board, if it's industry, it's got to be about business. And so this War Industries Board was big government activism, big government progressivism to control the economy during the war. Remember that during a wartime economy, things are different. It's not about people buying from the economy and spending the economy and spurring on the economy, but it's the government forcing where people focus their attention, whether it's the businesses or the consumers. And so the War Industries Board would be in charge of coordinating military purchasing from what places they would purchase. The government also established industrial priorities, what would be important for these companies to produce. And then there's also an allocation of scarce materials and standardization of production. And so during this time period, there really is no freedom of the economy. There's really no pure capitalism. And so many saw the dangers or were afraid of this economic intervention that the government was having. However, some positives of this was the National War Labor Board. They accomplished improving working conditions for laborers. Also, they recognized the right of labor unions to collectively bargain, that if labor unions had a complaint, that they could negotiate those complaints. And also they established the 8-hour workday. And this all happened because labor was so important during World War I that the government recognized that laborers needed to be heard so that they wouldn't go on strike and hurt the war effort. Liberty bonds were sold by the government to raise money for the war. So oftentimes parents would buy Liberty bonds for their children instead of birthday gifts to show patriotism. And this is money that you would give to the government, and then the government after the war would give you back your money with interest. So it was basically a loan that the government was having to fund World War I. These are examples of propaganda posters to get people to buy Liberty bonds instead of buying consumer products and other items. The Committee on Public Information was focused on propaganda. It was essential to gain support for the war. So these are examples of propaganda posters. Remember that propaganda is a half-truth or an encouragement to do something by the government. So there was a lot of shaming happening. This is kind of the first cancel culture in American history where anything German is bad. And so there's a lot of demonizing and undermining of German culture and Germans in general in order to beat the Germans during World War I. So the war ends. We have something called Armistice Day. Today we call this Veterans Day, November 11th, 1918. On the 11th month of the 11th day, the 11th hour, the 11th minute was the armistice signed to end World War I. But we call it now Veterans Day because the end of World War I isn't as special as it was before World War II. Germany was then punished. They had to admit guilt, total guilt for the war. They had to reduce their military to 100,000 troops. They had to pay war reparations, and they had to give back land to France. And also the country of Poland was created out of German territory. Now, the admission of guilt was the biggest thing that made the Germans unhappy, and it was really Adolf Hitler that really exposed that anger and resentment over admitting guilt in his book Mein Kampf. When they do reduce their military, other countries, including the United States of America, reduced their military so much during World War II, or actually during the 1920s, before World War II, that the German reduction of their military actually became a non-issue because other countries were reducing their military as well, because we didn't think that another world war would happen. These reparations definitely would affect Germany, and their German money would not be worth as much, and the worldwide economic depression that happens really hits Germany a lot more. The League of Nations then would be established, and this was Wilson's 14th point. Wilson of the United States of America, the president, becomes the architect for post-war negotiations and for a post-world after the war. World War I was so terrible that they never wanted a World War II. And so this plan was to create peace. It was an international organization. However, America does not join this League of Nations. The reason that they don't join is because we don't want our hands tied by other nations. As you can see in this picture right here, we don't want other nations to tell America what to do to keep us from war. And so America basically creates the League of Nations, but then doesn't join it themselves. It's kind of like organizing a party, inviting everybody, and then not showing up yourself. So kind of comical that we didn't join this, but it also makes sense. The Committee on Public Information, as we mentioned before, is all about propaganda. And so this picture right here is kind of a propaganda piece as well, this cartoon. So the reservationists really opposed participation in the League of Nations, and they felt like it would really limit Congress's power to declare war, as you can see on this picture. Basically, it would tie America's hands, and we didn't want that to happen. We don't want the world or the League of Nations to tell us when we could not declare war. So that's why we did not join the League of Nations. World War I is called the Great War because World War II hadn't happened yet. So that's definitely worth noting as well. That is the end of our notes there. Please do a review and put the big ideas on the left margin and create a one-sentence summary. Thank you very much.